2015, Trump launched what he described as the largest trade war in economic history. The message was straightforward: impose heavy tariffs on imports, shift costs onto foreign producers, bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States, and make the economy more self-reliant. At first glance, this argument seemed reasonable and even appealing to many voters. That argument rested on what appeared to be a simple chain of reasoning. As imported goods became more expensive, American consumers would turn to domestically produced alternatives. Rising demand would bring factories back to life, workers would be called back to their jobs, and industrial communities would be revived. But real-world economics does not operate according to the tidy logic of campaign slogans. What followed clearly demonstrated how intentions that sound positive, when combined with a fundamental misunderstanding of markets, can lead to severe and long-lasting consequences. The first cracks appeared almost immediately, even though much of the public did not yet see them. When Trump imposed a 25% tariff on imported steel in March 2018, the administration believed domestic steel production would surge, blast furnaces would reopen, and steelworkers would quickly regain the jobs lost to foreign competition. Reality, however, moved in a very different direction. Instead of being protected, American businesses that relied on steel as a production input were immediately placed at a disadvantage as costs soared. From automakers and appliance manufacturers to construction firms and machinery producers, companies across the economy saw raw material prices jump sharply in a very short period of time. Faced with that situation, companies were left with only a handful of options. They could absorb higher costs and accept eroded profits, pass those added costs on to consumers through higher prices, or reduce the amount of steel used in production. In practice, most firms ended up doing all three at once. Prices rose, profit margins narrowed, and products were redesigned to use less steel. There was, however, another option that the architects of the tariff policy appear not to have considered. Businesses began shifting production abroad to markets where they could purchase steel at global prices rather than being forced to pay artificially inflated domestic prices. Within just 18 months, the number of jobs lost in U.S. steel-using manufacturing industries far exceeded the number of jobs created in the steel sector itself. Tariff barriers that were promoted as a way to protect American workers ultimately accelerated the relocation of production beyond the country's borders. By 2020, total employment in steel-related manufacturing sectors was actually lower than it had been before the trade war began. Steel was not an isolated case. The same pattern was repeated almost intact across every other major round of tariffs. Duties on aluminum pushed aerospace and automotive companies to increase their reliance on components from foreign suppliers. Tariffs on washing machines raised consumer prices by roughly 12%, while encouraging manufacturers to shift even more operations to Mexico and Canada. Tariffs on solar panels dealt a severe blow to the domestic installation industry, resulting in more jobs lost than the total number of workers employed across the entire U.S. solar manufacturing sector. All of these outcomes were, in reality, entirely foreseeable. Economists had warned of these consequences from a very early stage, yet the political appeal of simple, forceful promises overwhelmed the complexity of real-world economics. The cost was not borne by those who made the decisions, but by workers and communities whose livelihoods depended on industries damaged by those very choices. When extended to China, the effects of the tariffs revealed an even harsher picture. Trump imposed tariffs on more than $350 billion worth of imports from China, pledging that Beijing would bear the losses and that American businesses would benefit. In reality, however, tariffs are not paid by foreign governments. They are collected from importers, meaning U.S. companies pay up front, and the costs are ultimately passed on to American consumers through higher prices. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimated that the tariffs imposed by Trump on Chinese goods cost the average American household about $831 a year in higher prices. But the real impact of this policy ran far deeper than the additional amount consumers had to pay out of pocket. When U.S. companies were cut off from efficient access to global supply chains, this did nothing to strengthen domestic manufacturing. On the contrary, it eroded the sector's foundations by leaving American producers at a disadvantage compared with foreign competitors that remained fully integrated into international supply networks. Consider a concrete example. Imagine you are running an electronics assembly company in Ohio, competing directly in global markets with firms from South Korea, Germany, and Taiwan. If tariffs force you to pay an extra 25% for key components, While your competitors can still purchase those same inputs at market prices, your competitive position does not improve. It deteriorates sharply. At that point, you are left with only two choices: accept lower profits, raise prices and gradually lose market share, or move production to another country where you can access components without artificially inflated costs. Thousands of American businesses found themselves in precisely this position between 2018 and 2021, and a significant number chose to leave. A policy promoted as a way to bring manufacturing back to the United States instead became a force pushing it further away. And once production lines are established elsewhere, the likelihood of them returning is very low. The reason is straightforward. The upfront costs of investment, workforce training, and building supply chain relationships are largely irreversible. That makes relocating production back home economically irrational, even if tariffs are later removed. Meanwhile, the countries targeted by the tariffs adjusted far more quickly than Washington had anticipated. China did not collapse under trade pressure. In fact, the opposite occurred. Beijing accelerated its strategy of reducing dependence on the U.S. market. Within just 3 years, China signed major trade agreements with 15 Asian countries, expanded infrastructure investment through the Belt and Road Initiative, and significantly increased trade with Europe, Africa, and South America. The result was not capitulation to Washington, but a deep and broad diversification process that substantially reduced U.S. leverage. Today, trade between China and the European Union has surpassed that between China and the United States. In many key sectors, China's leading trading partners are no longer the U.S., but Germany, South Korea, or Vietnam. The trade war did not cause China to collapse as many had expected. On the contrary, it forced China to learn how to build an economic system that is less vulnerable to pressure from the United States, reflecting a fundamental shift in the global balance of economic power. For decades, access to the U.S. market was regarded as the ultimate prize that every developing economy sought. Many countries were willing to restructure their entire trading systems simply to maintain favorable relations with Washington, because American consumers represented the world's most lucrative market. But when the United States turned that access into a tool of pressure through unpredictable tariffs and constant trade threats, other countries began to build alternative networks. The European Union accelerated the expansion of its trade ties with Asia and Africa. Japan strengthened its trans-Pacific partnerships. Even long-standing U.S. allies began to adjust their economic strategies, reducing their reliance on the American market in favor of partners that were more stable and predictable. The message was clear: if access to the U.S. market comes with persistent political risk, the wiser choice is to spread that risk across other markets. Yet perhaps the heaviest consequences of the trade war fell on American agriculture. Farmers, who had been among Trump's most loyal supporters, suddenly found themselves on the losing end of a retaliation spiral for which they were wholly unprepared. When Washington imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, Beijing responded immediately with duties targeting U.S. soybeans, corn, wheat, and pork. The figures tell a bleak story. U.S. soybean exports to China fell by more than 80% between 2017 and 2019. Corn exports dropped by as much as 85%. Wheat all but disappeared from the Chinese market. In just a few months, an entire web of trade relationships built over decades was dismantled. And unlike industrial supply chains, agricultural markets are especially difficult to rebuild because they rely on long-term contracts, infrastructure investment, and buyer relationships that take many years to establish. The Trump administration sought to offset farmers' losses through direct support, spending more than $28 billion on what were called trade mitigation payments. But subsidies cannot replace real markets. Instead, they create dependency. As China shifted to importing soybeans from Brazil and Argentina, while building new supply chains across South America and Eastern Europe, those relationships did not simply disappear once trade tensions eased. 5 years on, U.S. agricultural exports to China have still not returned to pre-trade war levels. The market share that moved to Brazilian and Argentine producers has, to this day, not been fully recovered. Agricultural communities that had taken generations to build export-oriented businesses suddenly found themselves struggling to survive, not because their land was less fertile or their farming techniques outdated, but because they were swept into a government-initiated trade war in which their products had little chance of prevailing. The resulting economic damage was immense. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York estimated that, at its most intense phase, The trade war reduced U.S. GDP by roughly $7.8 billion